So, firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone for coming today. It's so brilliant to have so many people joining us this afternoon. When we started putting this event together, we anticipated we'll probably get about 15, 20 people signing up. So when we've had over 100 people express interest from all over the country, it really is amazing to see the level of interest in this area. So in terms of introductions, my name's Andy McGowan. I'm the Head of Carer Services at Caring Together. You'll see that we've been working alongside the University of Portsmouth, Winchester and the UEA to put on this forum today. If I can ask my colleague Belinda to go to the next slide, please. So just a few bits of housekeeping. If people can keep your microphones on mute the whole time until we're in the breakout rooms later on, that would be much appreciated. If you've got any questions as we go through, please do put them in the chat. We'll try and keep an eye on them to sort of answer all of those as we go through. And for those of you who are active on Twitter, you'll see we're using the hashtag YC Research and Practice. So please do tweet as you're going through this afternoon's session. Go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the agenda today, we'll be starting with myself and Dr. Emma Maynard from the University of Portsmouth, just really setting the scene. How did this event come together? What are we trying to achieve from this event today? Then we're going to give a bit of an insight into 3 different pieces of research that have been going on over the past year, looking into different elements of young carers and young adult carers' experiences. We will then have a question and answer session with the panel. And again, if you have any questions as we go through the presentations today, please do put them in the chat and we'll try to keep an eye on them as we go through. You'll be glad to know there will be a comfort break at 2:30. And when you come back, we'll come into some breakout rooms for a bit further discussion as well. And then we'll be ending this afternoon's event with remarks from Professor Saul Becker, giving his reflections on today's conversations. Next slide, please. So just in terms of setting the scene, where did this event or this idea for an event come from? So as a head of a service for a young carers organisation, I'm sure many of you will be in a similar position where you get lots of emails coming through asking, can your young carers help with this? Or we've got this survey that we're really keen to get young carers' perspectives from. And so actually, we get lots of requests like this. And what we tend to find, and particularly what we found over the past 18 months or so, is quite often requests have come in where there's similar bits of research going on in different parts of the country on different topics, but actually it seems that, are they joined up? Are they linking up to reduce duplication, to actually increase the opportunities to get the spread further? And so it's always been identified as a real area for opportunity to join sort of academics up, also with those organisations working with young carers in practice. But also, like many of you, we spend a lot of our time doing funding bids, whether it's doing grant applications, whether it's doing sort of tender bids for commission services. And all of the time we're being asked, what is the need? Why do you need to support this group of individuals? Now, what does the evidence say? And so to have the opportunity to use the research that's out there to inform what we're wanting to do in practice and we think needs to be done is a real benefit from my perspective. And so this was an idea that we had, but what really set it in motion, if I can go to the next slide, was if I take you back to the start of the COVID pandemic. So this was actually end of April last year. This quote you can see on the screen came from one of our young carers. As you can see, it is a bit of a controversial statement, or thinking, is it polarizing? Is it taking sides? But actually, no, it wasn't. And I think with this quote, it's worth saying this wasn't a young carer who's never been involved with anything before. It's not a young carer who's only recently started getting involved with things. This was actually one of the young people who's involved in our Norfolk Young Carers Forum project, a project which is designed to help young carers and young adult carers have their voices heard. And what really struck me was, even for this young person to be saying at the start of the pandemic, it feels like no one's listening to us. And what actually sparked this is because she saw on Twitter advertising for carers to take part in a survey to say, what was the impact of the COVID pandemic? How is it impacting on them? She got really frustrated because actually it was for carers aged 18 plus. And she'd seen a few of these out there. And she'd say, well, where's the survey asking us what our experiences are like? Where's the surveys or people asking for our experiences and our views on what needs to happen during this first lockdown? And so that's why we committed to really trying to help make a difference with that. If I can go on to the next slide, please. So that's where we linked in with Dr. Kate Blake-Holmes from the University of East Anglia to really try and change that. So we worked with these young carers and said, okay, if you think you're not being heard, what is it you need to do? What is it we need to do to try and change that? And so what we did is we worked with them to help produce their own survey. So they put together the questions, they helped decide how we were going to get it out to people. They even did their own TikTok videos to try and get the message out in their way to young people. But we also linked the young carers into the research that Kate committed to doing, to really starting to look at those experiences from an academic perspective, or from a research-driven view. And what difference did it have? Not only did it enable them to have their voices heard in Norfolk, but all of a sudden, in a matter of weeks, these young carers, as you can see here, were on Times Radio. They were on, in terms of radio, BBC News, they're on Radio 4, they're on Sky News, they're on Heart Radio. All of a sudden, these young carers felt their voices were being heard, even to the extent of in Parliament as well. And it really made a difference for them. It meant that they felt like they were being heard, but not just being heard, but that change was happening. So in Norfolk, the voices of young carers through the research, through the surveys that they were doing on the ground with us and other young carers, led to emergency planning for young carers. It gave us evidence for grant applications for bursaries. So we were able to secure over £20,000 for young carers bursaries. It also led to improved work with schools and data sharing in Norfolk to make sure that those young carers who couldn't work from home were being linked in and not being missed. And so all of a sudden, these young carers felt like they were making a difference, not just for them, not just for their families, but for young carers on a much larger scale. And so when this opportunity came up to say, actually, how do we make the most of this? How do we make the most of the interest there is in young carers from young carer organisations, and also make most of interest from young carers or academics working in this area, to really try and create some long-lasting change. So it's not just one-off pieces of work. It's not just a potluck as to which person you email and do they happen to know about this research. It's an opportunity for ongoing collaboration. And so that's where this event has come from today, to hopefully try and start something to bring together those in research, those in practice, and those with a real interest in young carers to try and make some real change. If I can go on to the next slide, please. And so with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Emma Maynard from the University of Portsmouth. And it was Emma who I met with earlier this year to really say, we've got this idea, how do we put it into practice? And that's where we are today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Emma.
Thanks, Andy. It's so good to be here. And as I'll explain in a minute, my career started what turned out to be quite a long time when I did the sums. But I started working with young carers a long time ago, and there's a few names on the call that I recognise very, very well. Certainly Saul, I was in conferences as a very young practitioner looking in awe, so I'm just so thrilled that you're with us, but a few other names as well that I hope to kind of connect with later. So my interest in young carers goes a long way back, and can you flick on the slide, please? Hi, Saul, thank you. So 1996 to 2006, I was working with young carers. I was a practitioner, and then I was managing a project with the local authority, and before that the third sector, and it was all about young carers by those terms. And then at 2006 I started being an early help manager, and young carers wasn't in my job title anymore. And now from 2014 to now, I'm doing family research. The thing I know from all of this is that it doesn't matter what context we're in. If we're working with children and families, we're working with young carers. And what I'm kind of interested in terms of this space is how we talk about these children now. How has our language and our perspective changed around young carers from what seemed to be a very niche, kind of cornered out part of working with children a long time ago, and the work that's gone on in bringing the needs of those children and families very much into the forefront. So the language and the lens and the perspective seems to shift around these children and families. And the narratives around them seem to be highly politicized. Now, Andy's just given us a brilliant example of that with our young carer quote and about the clap for carers. You know what? She's right. Still, these children are pretty much hidden. And unless we truly go looking, and unless we use the language of care in ways that are accessible to families and resonate with families, they stay hidden. So in the most recent bit of my work, I've been looking at complex family situations. I haven't gone specifically looking for young carers. I've been thinking about how do parents seek help and receive help, and what are the complexities in and around their families, and how are schools identifying and responding to these needs. And because I had that perspective on it, not one of these participants, as 24 families and 28 school leaders over the last few years, not one of them mentioned young carers, and yet every single one of them talked about young carers. I'll have another slide, thanks. Is it going on? Can we click on? Oh no. Are we all right? Is it frozen? There we go, brilliant, okay. So I talked to 24 parents in 2 phases of a project. This is qualitative, it's inductive, and basically what I'm trying to do is get hold of people's stories. So it's dialogic methods that I'm trying to get to a narrative about how they sought and accepted help, and their journey through that, from the need for help all the way through to that point of crisis, and the onward journey, because we know that for whatever reason families seek help within social care, we know that around 50% of them come back again after they've made progress, after their case has been closed. There's a shorter term recovery, and then about 50% of them need to come back again. So I was really interested in that bit. Can you click on again? Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, so these are just a few key findings. I didn't want to absorb too much time today. But in terms of young carers, and the reason that we're all gathered here was that I found a real symbiosis of particularly mental health needs, but also health needs more generally. Parents talked about themselves and their children in very symbiotic ways. So they said things like, we both spiraled together, talking about the way in which their mental health and their children's mental health went day to day. And as one went down, the other one went down. They also talked about how they were able to sustain their recovery all the time their child was doing well. So their child's wellness and happiness seemed to be a key motivator for keeping both of them well and functioning. Their parents' mental health directly seemed to influence their ability to cope with their children's complex needs. And these parents were talking largely in the past as well, so kind of past, present, and a little bit future as well, and talking about how when they were very low, they weren't able to cope with their children's needs, and how their children's mental health needs were shown through behavioural distress, through challenging behaviour, huge amounts of exclusions from schools, those kind of narratives that those of us who work around young carers hear in a different form. We hear that around a different kind of language very often. Their disabilities, there are a number of parents with multiple sclerosis who are wheelchair users, as well as mental health difficulties. And they talk, but what was really interesting to me was that they talked about their needs without any reference to the direct impact on the child. So it felt like it was very much in a melting pot of family experience. There wasn't one case where I felt the families were singling out the child's experience in light of their own needs, and vice versa. It just wasn't possible to extrapolate who's a carer and who is being cared for. But it's sometimes that real parentified notion of what happens with children who take on caring responsibility was clearly evident. And parents seem to struggle to share things with their children, their possessions, experiences as well, and emotions with their children. So at times of crisis, there was a real separateness in what was going on in the family. I must flag, this is articulated by parents. The voice of the children is kind of next project on. I also found stigma absolutely huge. Now, we know from research by Naomi Eisenberger that social rejection and stigma impacts the brain in the same way as physical pain. It's virtually identical. The way our brain receives those messages about physical assault is the same as a social rejection. And the more we can process that and bring that into the sort of frontal lobe part of the brain, the more that the experience of pain kind of dampens down and lessens. So stigma was absolutely massive. And these families are surrounded by stigma by help seeking, stigma from the services that they seek help from, or they have to seek help from, they have to engage with help from, otherwise things start getting a little bit spicy. And also in terms of their own self-narratives about their parenting, their mental health, the series of crises that brought them to the point of help, the interface with social, complex social issues like domestic abuse and so on. Stigma was absolutely massive, and they talked about it enormously as well. One of the key themes across the whole data set was about parents feeling that they are good parents and their self-narrative about what kind of parent they were. A lot of justification, a lot of explaining away things that they perceived to be failures in the past. And I'm using that as a representation of their perspective on this, not mine. But also what we found going into the schools research, and a couple of my collaborators are here today, Amy, give you a shout out, Amy Warhurst from Winchester as part of this project, is that the schools seem to be moving very much towards a whole family perspective. And that seemed to be a very dramatic change from, and I was a whippersnapper back in 1996. Can I have the next slide, please, Belinda? So this care and caring seemed to be very much sat in the kind of community environment. It seemed impossible to separate out a caregiver and a care receiver. And children's own needs seemed to be very much positioned still as challenging and disruptive behaviour. They weren't talked about as having caring responsibilities at home. Now, I think I put this on the last slide, but let's not worry about going back. But way back when, in the midst of time, and I worked this out as being 24 years in between, I had had a letter from a school that said, "We do not have any young carers here." In the last few months, I've gone back to that school and talked to them about how they respond to complex family needs. This time, they said, "School never closes a case." So I think we can see some changing patterns here. If we look at the evidence around how schools are engaging with families, we're seeing a big shift towards a massive amount of responsibility on the shoulders of schools, but also a willingness, particularly as we found in primary schools, for them to position themselves as front doors to community support, and a real willingness for that. In fact, when we asked them, do you want, if you had a bottomless pit of cash, would you give that money to the external agencies and get them to step up more? Or would you do it yourselves? And all of them, bar one example, said, give it to us. We want to do it. We know our families best. We're the most accessible point to them. We're the least feared point of contact. So I would be really interested today to hear about what your experiences are of working with schools and whether this is something we can explore further. They seem to be positioning themselves in that key place of support. I didn't want to take up too much time, and now I've probably gabbled, but our question for you today is really about where are the synergies between practice and research? A lot of us who are here from the university sector are really passionate about research which makes impact in practice and which is accessible to practice. So we're particularly interested in how do we get these routes through from, through paywalls where the publications are sitting in journals, out to the sector in ways that are meaningful and can make impact in people's lives. So there we go. Andy, back to you.
Thanks ever so much, Emma. And I think this is really just helping to see what a journey that's been on over the past few years. I was at a talk being given by Professor Saul Becker on Friday, where he's commenting exactly on what a journey we've come in terms of awareness of young carers and that culture change. So going from we don't have any young carers to actually we never close a case from that perspective. And no doubt there is so much more to do. And I think the next three speakers we're going to hear from really cover some of those key areas where actually we know there's some pockets of really great work going on, whether it's in relation to research or whether it's in relation to practice. But I think now is the opportunity. And I think over the next year, it's going to become even more important. I think with the social care reforms, with the challenges being faced, it's going to be more important than ever for organisations who work with young carers, to academics doing research in this area, to make sure that those voices aren't lost, to make sure that those issues aren't lost, and also the work that's already been done doesn't get put on the back burner. So I think the 3 topics we're about to hear from now will give a really good indication into some of those areas. So we're going to start off with Dr. Amy Warhurst and Dr. Sarah Bayless from the University of Winchester, talking about an absolutely crucial issue. I don't need to go into the statistics around young carers in education. We know the impact it has on their schooling, whether it's attendance, whether it's being bullied, whether it's their future prospects. And there's so much great work going on in practice on the ground. Ourselves, we have a scheme called the Carer Friendly TIC programme, an accreditation programme to help schools identify and support young carers. That's happening in our area. There are lots of other young care organisations doing similar work, whether their own schemes or whether national programmes such as the Carers Trust and Children's Society Young Carers in Schools programme. But we know there's still so much more to be done. When we're looking at infant carers aged 5 to 7, how much do we know about their experiences in education? When it comes to data sharing and knowing who are our young carers, so much more to be done. Then when we come to young adult carer transitions assessments, I think many of us on this call will be familiar to what is quite honestly a postcode lottery at the moment. There are some areas where the transitions assessment is really well set up, it's embedded, it's being delivered in practice, and most importantly, making a difference to young adult carers at that key stage of their life. But we know there are plenty of other areas where, if we're being honest, they probably don't even exist right now. Or if you said to a young adult carer, if you had a young adult carer transitions assessment, they wouldn't even be able to tell you. And then finally, the piece of work that I talked about in my opening remarks earlier will be about the impact of the COVID pandemic on young carers and young adult carers as well, and what we learn from it as we're moving into this next phase. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Amy and Sarah.
Hi everyone, so I'm Sarah Bayless. I'm in the Department of Psychology at the University of Winchester, and together with my colleague Amy, we are going to give you an overview of our current research. If I could just have the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to give you an overview of our research project, which is school-based support for young carers, best practice, barriers and enablers, and that's in collaboration with Emma Maynard. So first of all, thank you very much for having us today. It's really exciting to be here with everyone. So in the presentation, what we're going to do is to give you an outline of our current project. So generally what we're interested in is the experience of teachers and support staff in primary schools and in secondary schools who are involved with supporting young carers. And their families as well, importantly. So the work is currently still a work in progress, but what we're hoping to do is to give you an overview of the aims around why we're running this project, and we've also got some really interesting findings already so far to share with you. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we know, and it's already been mentioned as well, we know that the information and the support for teaching and support staff has significantly improved in recent decades. So we've got a growing awareness around young carers and a recognition for their circumstances and the needs that young carers have. And alongside that, there's been sort of an improvement in the kind of guidance and the supportive literature around young carers in schools as well. And typically what we see is that in those resources, they tend to focus on 5 key kind of actions. So they include inviting conversation, raising awareness, providing pastoral care, academic support, and to signpost to outside support agencies. And really our primary aim for our research project is to better understand how those key actions translate into the everyday experiences of the people who are supporting young carers in schools, so the teaching staff and the support staff, and really what their experience is of supporting those children on a day-to-day basis. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the necessity to better kind of understand what contributes to maybe best practice and what the barriers or the challenges might be, there's a lot of highlights really in the empirical literature, and which kind of outlines the sorts of difficulties that young carers might face. So for example, the literature very consistently talks about young carers being disadvantaged both economically as well as socially. and that is very often very tightly linked to their restricted educational opportunities. So we've already touched on that as well, with children missing school, perhaps arriving late to school because of their caregiving responsibilities, and also that the emotional and the practical impacts of caregiving can interfere with those children's school days and their ability to really take part in the school day and make the most of their abilities there as well. Kind of related to that as well, there's quite a lot of literature that identifies that young carers are often victims of bullying behaviours in schools. And then when we look at young carers talking about their own support needs, they often identify opportunities for respite, and particularly the ability to really properly take part in community life, to be able to take part in social activities with friends and so forth, and to fully be able to attend school and be part of the school community in that sense as well. And they also regularly identify the need for better support for their cared for relative as well. And of course, all those things feed into the need for better social policies to support those young people. Okay, the next slide, please. Oh, the one before that, please. That's it, thank you. So in addition to the challenges and the kind of potentially detrimental, or the often detrimental impacts that young caregiving has on young carers' lives and their development, often in the literature there's also a discourse around positive gain. So we can come across things like potentially increased resilience and maturity amongst young people who provide care for a family member or relative. And that could be a bit of a positive focus, I suppose, both for the young carers themselves and also for the people around them who are supporting them. So that's one of the things that we'd like to explore in our research, to see how that might pan out in practice and experience of the teachers and the support staff looking after the young carers in schools. Another thing that we're keen to explore around the definitions and the approaches for identifying young carers in schools. We know that sometimes families aren't particularly keen to come forward and ask for help because of reasons around stigma and so forth. So we are keen to kind of explore what schools can and are doing around identifying young carers, and then also in terms of involving outside agencies and building these interdisciplinary teams to provide support for their young carers. And the research is, at least in part, kind of building on a quantitative study from 2017, so the poll by Barnardo's and YouGov, which really highlighted a kind of common feeling of a lack of support across UK schools. So that was a quant study, and it was about 800 schools that took part in that. And there's a lot of themes running through that around a lack of formal support or specific supporting actions that schools might have in place, and a really strong feeling amongst teachers and head teachers that a lot more should be put in place and needs to be done to support these young people. Okay, next slide, please. So our aim, so we're interested, of course, to explore the themes around the staff experiences of supporting young carers in schools, and how that would contribute to the empirical evidence around the impacts of young caregiving, so that kind of more research side of things. But really importantly, our kind of overarching aim is also the more applied side to it, and to identify potential barriers in regional schools. So to collate common experiences and to really be able to raise awareness and highlight those barriers. And then secondly, to be able to identify good practice and how that might be shared between schools. So that could be, for example, innovative or creative ideas that schools have been able to put together or to develop in order to speak to those 5 key aims about starting conversations, supporting academically and pastoral care, and signposting and so forth. So to be able to share that good practice between schools. And then finally, perhaps also to be able to increase communication between feeder schools. So again, sharing common experiences between schools and best practices around the type of information and the streamlining of that information that might be useful to share between a primary and a secondary school in order to facilitate the support for the young carers in that community. Okay, next slide. So to give you a quick overview of what we did, we invited 470 Hampshire schools by email, and that was to take part in our 1-hour interview. And so far we've had 18 be able to give up an hour of their time to be able to speak with us about their experiences of supporting young carers. So our interviews are semi-structured, and we identified a couple of key questions to go into those interviews, and they are built up around relevant literature, but also from initial conversations, some informal conversations with key stakeholders as well. So really the framework for the questions are to talk about experiences of young carers in school. We also had a magic wish question, so a more open question to allow our respondents to describe what they would do if there was no barriers, if they could put into place whatever they would like to put into place, what would it be? We've also asked our respondents to talk about barriers to supporting young carers that are not necessarily seated in financial or resource type issues, and what schools have been able to do in order to overcome some of those barriers. And then we have a series of additional questions that mostly will try to pick up on some of the themes that have been mentioned, maybe get some more details, and to follow up on some of the information that the respondents shared with us. I'm going to hand over to Amy to tell you about some of the findings that we have so far.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so as Sarah has said, we haven't really finished the thematic analysis of the interview transcripts as yet. We're, I think, 2 away from finishing, but already we've managed to identify some quite interesting themes that speak to the areas that we identified in our aims, and some of which reflected in the literature. So the interviewees were all members of school staff, either from the senior leadership team, were Senkos or safeguarding leads, or were involved in some way in providing emotional or behavioural support to students. Interviewees have consistently mentioned the difficulty of identifying young carers. And this can be issues related to the reluctance of families to ask for help, to the subtle normalisation over time, meaning that children or families just may not recognise that the children are young carers. And of those that do, young people can be sometimes reluctant to disclose what's happening at home for stigmatising reasons, or just being frightened about what the next steps might be. Another common theme relates to the nature of young carer roles and the fact there is such a wide variety in terms of the responsibilities that young carers might be asked to take on at home. And the common theme really is that there's an acceptance that these are over and above what is normally considered appropriate for their age. And again, an acknowledgement that there can be quite complex relationships between a young carer and, for instance, a parent that they're caring for, in that the normal child-parent relationship has been distorted somewhat, and some of the issues that that can create. It does seem quite common for schools not to have a separate policy for young carers or any specific action plan for young carers per se, but rather that they get joined into a policy overall for vulnerable children. So themes highlighting the types of support that schools offer, so communication between the school and the parents and the families, and the process of referring those families on for outside support. These are all quite of interest for identifying best practice. And further themes relating to the social, emotional and academic needs relate to themes that identify where potential gaps might be in terms of available resources and provision for young carers. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we've got some interesting initial findings, and these tend to confirm the impression that the nature of support varies quite widely from school to school. And that seems due to a multitude of different factors, but quite often due to availability of staff and the level of resources available to the school. A common emerging sub-theme as well is the reliance of schools on outside agencies or charities to support them in supporting their young carers. So almost all of the schools acknowledged and praised the charities and the organisations that they work with, and really highlighted how much they do extra that the school wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Another common theme emerged around communication. So schools repeatedly stressed just how essential it was to have close, trusting and open relationships with their pupils and with families, in order to allow difficult conversations to happen, in order for families or young carers to disclose those caring responsibilities, and for the school to identify how best to help each individual pupil and their circumstances. We wanted also to elaborate on some other themes here as well. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So there are quite a lot of sub-themes around identification of young carers, including how to identify young carers. And there was an acknowledgement again from schools that they are reliant on the young carer disclosing themselves, or the family of the young carer disclosing the caring responsibilities. For secondary schools, there was reliance on primary schools to identify them in that transition process, or just a reliance on staff spotting some warning signs that this pupil might be struggling, and then delving a little bit into why that might be. So how best then, once they have identified them, to offer them or their family the support in a sensitive way. And there's a recognition there that there just isn't a simple set of criteria for young carers. There's no one definition, and there's a lot of variety. Again, there's that acknowledgement that people experience barriers in referring to outside agencies, and that could be, again, because the family is reluctant to have that label of young carer, or the young carer themselves being reluctant to have that label, and that can be for a whole variety of reasons. But also the agency themselves being completely swamped, and having so many people applying for their services that they have to start adding in a very strict criteria in order to try and keep the numbers at a manageable level. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So also noted in a lot of the interviews that we conducted is the restriction that young carers face in terms of educational access, support and opportunities. So a lot of the schools mentioned that they tried to put in a lot of flexibility in terms of extending homework deadlines for young carers, offering homework clubs, and giving them lunchtime detentions rather than after school detentions and those sorts of things. However, a lot of the support in place for young carers did require young carers to miss lessons. So if they wanted to have a one-to-one meeting for emotional support or to discuss their concerns or worries, that often tended to be during lesson time. And many additional opportunities are offered after school, say music, sports or other academic clubs, so often after school clubs. And again, it was acknowledged that young carers can struggle to attend those, and therefore they miss a lot of those opportunities. And again, if that's academic clubs and things, they're then losing another opportunity. So they might struggle, therefore, things like GCSEs and so on. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So we know that there are almost as many ways to support young carers in school as there are schools that we spoke to. So each of them seem to be doing something a little bit different, but there were quite a lot of common aspects as well, and certainly holding clubs for young carers during lunchtime, making allowances for young carers to call home if they were worried about the person that they cared for, and that real emphasis over and over again about the emotional support to young carers from school staff. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So again, schools really keen to emphasise how amazing they think young carers are, and how they really want to be able to celebrate the achievements of young carers, not just in school, but wider society as well. And a lot of schools talked about that in terms of raising awareness about young carers, reducing the stigma, and just really celebrating how well young carers manage to juggle all the different aspects that they're dealing with. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some schools also did mention the resiliency and maturity levels of young carers, but this wasn't in many of the interviews, and certainly was less than we thought it might be, given that the literature often cited this for young carers in particular. So that might be something we want to follow up in future research. Next slide, please. Thank you. So schools were really hoping that at some point they could have extra staff capacity to support the young carers. So designated staff members were often doing multiple different roles, and looking after young carers was only a very small part of their job role. It just meant they couldn't be as dedicated to young carers as they actually wanted to be. There was also variation within schools. So some schools had an awful lot of identified young carers, which meant that staff were then very, very stretched in terms of offering individual one-to-one support for them. But conversely, those schools where there was only one or two identified young carers said that that really stopped them from running specific groups for young carers and those sorts of things, because they couldn't justify it based on the small numbers. So it became a more generic group and those sorts of things. So there were different advantages and disadvantages across the schools, but staff capacity was definitely raised as an issue. Also, schools really wanted to provide young carers with more opportunities for fun social activities, and a more normalised childhood was often mentioned in terms of just being able to have time to unwind, relax with friends, make new friends, and do just more activities really. So again, there's a wish from schools to have more funding available to support young carers. Next slide, please. Thank you. A specific enabler that came up a few times and was really much more specific than just simply asking for more funding or more staffing was the push for recognition for pupil premium. And this is for a variety of different reasons, including formal recognition from government and therefore wider society, better support systems therefore being able to be put in place, and perhaps taking the first steps then to a more formal definition of what being a young carer actually means. So yeah, we had more staffing wanted, more funding, and a push to have them recognised to be available for pupil premium funding. Okay, Sarah, I'm now going to hand back to you to discuss our next steps, but I'm aware we're running very tight on time, so can you talk quick?
I will. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you, Amy. So a couple of next steps. So what we're hoping to do is, of course, as we mentioned already, do some sharing of best practice. I think that's probably one of the most important things coming out of our research, is to be able to highlight the some of the really amazing things that we've seen in the interviews that schools have been putting into place, and that also we've seen that kind of idea of the acting as a hub and supporting the whole family, not just the child who is the young carer. We found it really interesting looking at the magic wish questions and the things that staff said that would really make a difference to supporting young carers and the kinds of supports that schools can offer. And it's not necessarily always around financial support, but also other aspects of building a community and building recognition for young carers as well. And then also to pull out information about who else should be providing support for young carers. So where could we strengthen the relationship and the bond with some of the more sort of outside agencies who are supporting schools with who are looking after young carers, or who have identified that they're looking after the young carers. I think that's it. I'm trying to go fast, sorry. Can we have the next slide, please? I think we're done. Yeah, thank you. So just thank you again for having us, and thank you for listening to our presentation. And we just wanted to briefly thank our research assistants, Eleanor and Jade, and also Daniel Phelps, who was involved with our initial discussions around the study as well. So thank you very much, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. It's worth saying this was designed very much just to be an insight, to give a bit of a flavour. We're never going to get all of the answers today, but it's very much designed to help spark some of these conversations and ideas for moving forward. So I'd like now to hand over to Catherine Quinn from the University of Portsmouth. I think so far we've heard about issues of young carers in education, but we know in terms of young adult carers transitions into adulthood can present a huge number of challenges, and they'll bring up issues about what support they get, how to ensure that they're identified, but also to see what barriers need to be removed to enable them to make that transition into a successful adulthood for them as an individual. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Catherine.
Good afternoon, my name is Catherine Quinn and I'm going to be presenting my master's research called But You Know It Feels Like a Lot to Ask For. So young adult carers' views on their experiences in higher education and sport that I've just completed at the University of Portsmouth. So next slide please. So why did I choose this topic? So research by the NUS in 2013 suggested that offers of help and identifying the need for support for young adult carers in higher education can often come too late. And in 2014, Sempic and Becker concluded a high number of young adult carers find it challenging to finish their course without receiving their suitable support, with 16% of young adult carers in their study reporting their concerns they may have to drop out of university, and 56% saying they were experiencing difficulties because of their caring role. So I decided to choose this topic to give qualitative insight into young adult carers' needs and to illuminate their voices by exploring their experiences of attending universities across the country and how they feel about current support available, building on existing qualitative research. The next slide, please. So I structured my research around the following three objectives. So to examine the priorities of young adult carers in making decisions about higher education, to explore the lived experiences of young adult carers attending higher education or anticipating applying for higher education, and to examine young adult carers' expectations and experiences of support while at university. So I conducted a semi-structured focus group that took place on Zoom. To recruit the participants, I contacted young carer organisations from across the country to find young adult carers who were interested in taking part. We had 5 young adult carers in the focus group, 2 were attending college and 3 were currently attending higher education, their ages ranging between 17 and 22. So I chose to use a co-production approach during the focus group in order to create recommendations with the young adult carers, in order to create recommendations for support. So as co-production approaches values people being experts in their own situations as a result of focusing on their lived experiences, empowering them to be active agents in the research process. So next slide, please. So this word cloud essentially gives you a sense of the most valuable topics that came up during the focus group. So it gave me a foundation to reflect on the significant themes discussed when I started my thematic analysis and what aspects of discussion were clearly viewed as important to the participants from their lived experiences. So next slide, please. So there were 3 main themes that came from the data. The first theme that emerged was a lack of awareness or understanding among the university community about young adult carers. So a prominent thing that one of the participants said during the discussion was a quote from a 22-year-old postgraduate who said he wanted professionals and peers in the university community to just make it normal to be a young adult carer attending higher education. So he followed on by saying, if you have some friends, you tell them you're a carer and all they think is you clean people and it's just a negative connotation. But really it's not, and people need to feel comfortable that they are carers and they are doing something good, rather than people kind of taking the piss out of them, really. So this derogatory comment, he's explaining his feelings of embarrassment about his role from the treatment he received from his peers about how they view carers' caring roles in the university environment. So another participant felt that there should be better educational training for professionals around young adult carers' roles and how their experiences in higher education can be affected. So she opened up about insensitive comments she had received from a lecturer about her personal experiences, and she believes that university staff need to be given better educational training about how best to support students and how to be more empathetic about their personal situations. So the second theme that was found was the accessibility of support. So this suggested support was not always easy to find, and they expressed that there was a lack of clarity about what support was available. So one participant who is contemplating applying for university stated that better visibility of support would encourage more young adult carers to go to university. And they also spoke about there not being support available in their university that was specifically catered for young adult carers. And multiple young adult carers spoke about finding the application process to access support really difficult as a result of the amount of proof that needed to be given and not always being easily able to give the proof. So the final theme was about how young adult carers
caring responsibilities affected their university experience. Some participants spoke about feeling a sense of guilt about leaving home for university, which could affect their choice of higher education. So one participant stated she believed the location of universities will affect her choice of where she will apply. And then in contrast, another participant discussed how her positive experience of support from a charity influenced her choice to go to university and ultimately enabled her to be able to move away from home and attend university further afield. And she stated that without the support from the charity, it really wouldn't have been on the cards. Other participants spoke about the conflict of trying to balance their studies with their caring role. One participant stated, "There's always a small amount of guilt that I'm neglecting one or the other. So I'm either neglecting my studies or I'm neglecting my responsibilities as a carer." And another participant brought up the topic of young adult carers' identity. So she spoke about finding living away from home unusual in a sense of identity, and she elaborated on this, explaining she felt that she had two different types of identities: the person she was at university and then the person at home. This like conflicting balance in identity about exchanging between the former life that they've moved away from and the new life they're about to experience, and the conflict of the two merging. So next slide, please, Belinda. So here are the co-produced recommendations that we came up with during the discussion. So with transition to university, one participant stated that their transition to university was really jarring. So she said, "It's a really different world when you move away to university and you're not at home anymore and you don't know what's going on." They recommended higher education institutions need to prioritise creating and enhancing support programmes that aim to specifically support young adult carers during their transition to higher education. So this could be in the shape of orientation activities that give young adult carers an opportunity to socialise and interact with other student carers at the start of their university experience. The next recommendation was awareness. The young adult carers spoke about wanting better awareness about young adult carers in the university community. The young adult carers involved in the focus group felt the best way for awareness to be increased was at open days, educational training being provided by the university for their fellow students and staff, an increase in online awareness platforms like blogs, and to organise a Young Carer Awareness Week in the university. So the next recommendation was accessibility of support. Young adult carers stated they wanted universities to improve the application process for applying, a more simplified and sensitive approach, which was more accommodating to their emotional involvement of their role. And they stated that they believed a designated team available to support them during this difficult process would be helpful. So the participants also came up with a recommendation for universities to improve visibility about what support is available for young adult carers in a more clearer and easier to access way. They predicted that clearer information on university websites and better information about what support consisted of would improve the ability for young adult carers to clearly understand what support was offered in the university. So the young adult carers spoke about wanting greater flexibility surrounding attendance, coursework and assessment. The want for this flexibility in study arrangements came from a concern they all experienced about not being able to meet their university commitments due to a change in their caring circumstances. Therefore, they wanted flexibility of study arrangements to ensure they could successfully continue their degree and graduate. So they spoke about what they wanted future support to look like. So recommendations from this came from, they wanted more informal support in the form of young carer societies, informal social groups, better financial support, transitional support, and support that exists throughout the student life cycle. So for example, career support and support around graduation. And finally, participants spoke about wanting their universities to implement young adult carer policies to ensure there are more adequate levels of support within their institutions. So this is a quote from a young adult carer who is in her first year of university. To think that there aren't many policies for young carers is a bit unnerving when you think about it. If something happens with a caring responsibility, then there is nothing for us to fall on. So this shows the importance of universities having a clear young adult policy in place, which outlines a clear package of support for young adult carers, which could lead to a more accommodating and welcoming environment in the university. So next slide, please. So the most critical recommendation resulting from this study is the need for universities to implement young adult carer policies nationally and institutionally. The one participant that mentioned having young adult carers in her university seemed to have the best experience of support compared to the other participants within the group. Also for higher education institutions to consider introducing a dedicated contact for young adult carers to speak to within the university if they are struggling or need signposting for support. This person will be aware of young adult carers' needs and proactive in making sure young adult carers within the university are having a more positive experience. And this will be particularly useful within the transitional stage of young adult carers starting university. Universities should enhance support across the student life cycle with support improvements in schemes such as widening participation schemes, support with application and admissions, and with career support. And then this support being adaptable to what they need at the time. So next slide, please. So to conclude, young adult carers are an under-recognised group within university communities whose needs are insufficiently supported. It's no surprise that young adult carers have high dropout rates and experience difficulties during their university experience due to this lack of support compared to their peers. Collective gender among higher education institutions to implement support and to enhance support systems to help young adult carers would resolve this issue and improve young adult carers' experiences in higher education. Furthermore, increased awareness and recognition within higher education institutions and society, along with one of the participants' suggestions to make it normal to be a young adult carer in university, would not only improve the experiences of young adult carers in higher education, but also young carers, young adult carers, and adult carers in general. So thank you for letting me present today. And I'm really interested in any further discussions with you about this topic, so I've included my email. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. It's really, really appreciated. And I think you've highlighted just so many different issues coming up there. And you'll see in the chat, you've already had a request for further contact from Camille in there. And I think what Sarah's put in the chat is a really key point, in that actually there are young carer organisations across the country. There are universities across the country who are doing some really brilliant work. So you saw in the chat around the work in Sheffield. We've been doing work with the University of East Anglia and their widening participation team. So in fact, their widening participation team actually has our Carer Friendly Tick Award, which was awarded by young carers. However, that's not consistent across the country, and it very much depends on the capacity of individual carer organisations, but also those individual preferences and commitment to young carers of those universities. So I was at a meeting last week with Carers Trust, where we're really highlighting that actually a few years ago, there was a huge campaign about getting Ofsted to, sorry, not Ofsted, apology, UCAS to include the opportunity to say that you're a young carer on your application. That was supposed to have come in this autumn, but hasn't as yet. It has for postgraduate, but not for undergraduate. And I think it goes beyond that. I think there's so much focus now, not just on getting young people into higher education in any form, and it's not just universities, also thinking in terms of apprenticeships and vocational training at higher levels, but also if they do get there, what is their experience? And I think, Catherine, that visual representation you showed really highlighted the need for that. So I think that's a really key area that I'd love to see us as a sector working on moving forward. So we're going to go into the final presentation now. So this is the one that I referenced at the start of the event, which really came about from the need to make sure that young carers' experiences during the pandemic were being listened to. So I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Kate Blake-Holmes from the University of East Anglia.
That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Andy, and thank you for everybody else that's done their presentations today. It's been really kind of fascinating and inspiring, and I really appreciate being given the time to share my research with you. So My name's Kate Blake-Holmes, and I'm a lecturer and researcher at the UEA. And as Andy said, we did a piece of research looking at the impact of COVID-19 on young carers during that first initial kind of sense of the pandemic and lockdown. So if I could have my next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of information about the background of the study, Andy's already spoken a lot about it, so I'll be really brief. But it was a very quick, very rapid review right at the start of that first lockdown. And it was really sparked by the feelings of young carers, as Andy had said, but also this awareness that as the news rolled in about the pandemic and the potential easements to legislation such as the CARE Act that were being proposed under the Coronavirus Act, there was a real sense for me about what about the young carers? Nobody's talking about the young carers and what's going to happen to them, and we really wanted to look into that. The aims of our study were to increase the recognitions of young carers, to build the awareness of the impact that those changes may be having on them, to capture the views of young carers about their current experiences, and really, especially within the focus of the pandemic, and as I say, with the potential easements that then had impacts on carers' assessments, to be suggesting that actually any child living with somebody with a long-term physical health condition, disability or mental health should be automatically considered as a young carer throughout that pandemic. So we combined the study in terms of the questionnaire that was completed with Caring Together, and I conducted interviews with 20 participants. The young carers that I spoke to ranged between the age of 12 and 22 and were fantastic at doing interviews in quite a kind of new way and remotely using different kind of technology and platforms, and taught me an awful lot about kind of Zoom and WhatsApp that I've never known before, so I'm eternally grateful for them for that. Could I have the next slide, please? So some of the key things that came out of the project, I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly now. The first major one was the complexity of care that young carers were providing. No two young carers are alike, nor is the care that they provide or the context in which they provide it. Many of the young carers that I spoke to were caring for multiple individuals, and many of them had care needs of their own. So it wasn't just this kind of simple quantifiable thing that we could identify and label and meet. There was a much more complex picture to that. Next slide, please. Also, there was an increase in the caring role as the pandemic sort of swept over the UK. So as the lockdowns were introduced, for many of the people that had been providing care, the care that was required was increased exponentially. So that may have been that all of a sudden they started having to care for younger siblings as well as potentially parents. That the pandemic itself was having an impact on younger siblings, and the lockdown and the removal of school was having an impact on younger siblings with additional needs, which was then increasing the kind of care role for the young people that I spoke to. It was impacting on their parents' care needs and also their parents' coping strategies. And also there were family and wider community impacts. So a lot of the young carers that I spoke to weren't just providing care within their role, within their home, but they were also reaching out of the home and providing care and support to family members or neighbours, particularly those that kind of presented as vulnerable and weren't able to kind of access support for themselves. So there was this huge increase in their caring role, and it happened very, very quickly. So there wasn't time for a lot of the young carers or the support services around them to really plan and to think through how this would be met. Next slide, please. So while these caring needs and caring expectations were going up, external support was often lost. So young carers were losing support from informal support, so from friends, families, neighbours that might have checked in before or helped with things. young carers I spoke to and parents that I spoke to talked about private arrangements that they'd made. So having cleaners come in or shopping delivery, all of a sudden that being lost as well. And also there was a loss of external support, so the kind of more formal health and social care support. So I spoke to one young carer whose father had complex mental health needs, but also very complex physical health needs. Following a stroke, he was physically disabled and needed physiotherapy and full personal care. And she talked about the fact that the physio team came in once and gave her a training session on how to do his daily physio with him. And she was left responsible for that, feeling really fearful about whether she was going to be able to get that right or wrong, and actually incredibly fearful that once she'd learnt those skills, that potentially the support would never come back again, because it would be seen that she was coping really well and could just carry on after the kind of pandemic had blown over. For a lot of young carers that I spoke to as well, because of the way that things had rapidly changed, many of them said that they hadn't been able to speak to services about crisis planning, and a lot of their anxiety was linked into what will happen if I become unwell. A, what will happen if I catch COVID and I give it to the people that I'm caring for, but also what happens if I become unwell, if I catch COVID and I can't continue to care? Who's going to come in? Who's going to kind of help with this? So a lot of the young carers felt really desperately that they needed to have that kind of crisis planning put in place. And I know that many of them spoke about young carers, organisations that they were involved with, really helping with that in terms of sitting down and helping them to think about crisis plans and contingency plans. But we know that while that's an amazing support for young carers, it's the tip of an iceberg, and that there's many, many young carers that aren't linked in to young carers organisations already. Can I have the next slide, please? So obviously education was another really big theme. And as Sarah said, young carers are already disadvantaged and impeded in terms of their school experience and their educational attainment. And that felt incredibly pertinent and incredibly anxiety provoking for them. So they had real issues in terms of how to manage the competing needs of providing care for those around them, and also being able to engage with remote learning. And some of that was just about not having the space, not having any quiet space to be able to do it. It was about them having to spend time supporting their younger siblings in accessing remote learning. But also for a lot of the young carers, they talked about the fact that they found it just impossible to focus on their remote learning, and that they were so overwhelmed and exhausted, they weren't able to really focus on the lessons in the way that they would have wanted to do. They talked about the fact that they really missed the school environment, that school was often a respite to them, and they felt that school was a safe space that they could focus on. Some of the young carers spoke very positively about the fact that teachers knew them well and were able to offer emotional support and pick up things when they weren't able to necessarily say it themselves. But so they were really missing that, and they were worried about how long it was going to be. Now, for some of these young carers, potentially they could have gone back to school. They could have gone back with the key worker kids and had their needs met that way. But for a lot of the young carers I spoke to, they didn't feel that that was an option for them, largely because they were fearful that if they went to school, they would then be exposing their families to the risk of COVID. But also just the practical thing of, if I go to school, who's going to care for the person that I'm caring for? Who's going to be around while I'm at school? So they didn't necessarily feel like that was a real option for them. And they felt that it really highlighted the gap between them and their peers, expressing very high levels of concerns about whether they will fall behind. Will I be behind when I go back? Will my teachers understand? How can I talk to them about why I'm behind and do it safely without risking further exclusion from my peers or stigma when I say about why I haven't been able to do my work? So they really worried that that gap that they already felt between themselves and their peers was going to be widened further when they came back, and the differences in the remote learning had been so obvious. Next slide, please. So the final theme came out around mental health and managing stress, which is not a surprising theme, really, but it was an incredibly powerful theme that both the young carers, the youth workers that I spoke to, and the parents that I spoke to talked about. So they talked about the fact that there was no respite for them. They talked about the fact that all of those coping strategies that they'd had before in terms of going out and speaking to friends wasn't there, and that the pressure was building up on them. Often they talked about the fact that they the difficulty that maybe a parent or a sibling had always had was looming larger and larger for them because they couldn't have that break from thinking about it. So they talked about becoming more and more anxious and worried about the person's physical illness or mental illness. And of course, this was all against a background of a pandemic, which was provoking fear and uncertainty and anxiety across the globe. So they had this kind of anxiety in terms of their role as a young carer, but also that was building on the anxiety that we all felt anyway. And they talked very much about the fact that they couldn't complain, that they needed to try to be independent, that they were very aware that other people did more than they did. I don't think that was the case in a lot of situations, but it's the way that they felt. And they also felt that it was much worse for the person that they were caring for, and for them to talk about how difficult it was for them would be upsetting for the person that they were caring for. So they felt that they had to hold things in a lot of the time. And the parents that I spoke to as well really struggled in terms of the increase of pressure on them and what that meant for their own mental health and their own physical health. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of finish off by thinking about that one thing just slightly in more kind of focus, because it particularly resonated with me. So I completely understood, and I predicted that young carers would talk about the fact that they were struggling with the reduction in respite, that they had no time to breathe, they would talk. What I didn't really think about, and maybe I should, but it was only as I was kind of going through the interviews, was that reduction of respite, that loss of the school kind of day to give the respite for the young carer also meant that there was reduced respite for the family member that they were caring for, and they almost had no time themselves to recover. So as Emma said in her opening comments, it's that symbiosis of mental health, that you're both spiraling together. So I spoke to one mum who had got long-term complex physical health conditions, and she would talk about the fact she had 4 children, and when the kids were at school, she would sleep for 4 or 5 hours of the day because that's what she needed to be able to do to manage her health condition, to manage her pain, and to be able to be up and around when the kids got home to cook their tea and do all the things that she needed to do in the evening. But with the kids all at home and everything else going on, she couldn't do that. So she found herself very quickly in a massive amount of pain and exhausted, and very aware that all of those things that she would have done before for the younger children, her 14-year-old was having to do day in, day out, caring for the children and caring for mum, that had really made herself more unwell by trying to kind of push through those pain levels. I also spoke to a father who had got severe and enduring mental health problems, and he talked about his fear that for many, many years he had managed, he felt, to really safeguard his children and protect his children from some of the more distressing elements of his experiences of mental ill health. Specifically, he was talking around self-harm and suicidal ideation. But again, when they're all locked in that house together, can't get away from each other, he's feeling the anxiety of the pandemic as well. So it's not like his distress is going to go away. He really worried that his children would then become more exposed to some of those more sort of distressing elements than he would ever have wanted them to be. Luckily, in this case, through the fantastic work of Caring Together, they did get the children into school. So this man could have a break and feel that he could kind of manage his own kind of mental ill health sort of safely. So next slide, please. So I guess the take home from that is, I think it's really important when we're thinking about young carers to also really adopt a whole family approach. We need to work using and thinking about the whole family. We can't silo the needs of young carers or the person that they care for. We need to recognise how the interconnected nature of their relationship and each of their well-beings. And also, we always need to be seeking to identify and challenge the structural inequality and the bureaucratic systems that make it more and more difficult for these for these families and these young carers to provide the care that they want to provide and also have the lives that they want to live. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish here because I don't want to take up all of your time, but I just want to say many thanks. And my email is here, and I know Andy's going to share the slides. And if there's anyone interested in any more, I've got a project report that I can send to you. And also Andy and I have written an article together, which fingers crossed should be published in the next week or two. Okay, many thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Kate, really highlighting just the variety of issues that came up during the pandemic. We're going to break out into a question and answer session with the panel now. So if I can ask all the speakers to turn their cameras on, and then I'm going to hand over to Emma to facilitate.
Thanks, Andy. They're just brilliant speakers. I'm buzzing with my own questions, but what I thought was if you have a question you'd like to pose, please pop it in the chat and I'll ask it for you and invite you to turn your camera on or something like that. We're not going to have long for this, but that is because we're trying to protect the time for you all to talk and feedback to us. So this isn't the kind of closing down of a conversation, it's the opening up of it. While people are just typing in their questions, which given the look of the chat is going to be quite busy, I think. Kate, I'm just fascinated what you had, and not least because with my research into schools, we were talking particularly with schools around COVID, and one of the things they were saying was that they learned so much more about their families because they were going to people's homes, offering food, offering resources. They learned so much more and were able to spot what was going on at home. And I think, it seemed to have really changed schools' perspectives on understanding the needs of their families and also leveling the playing field in terms of everybody needed help. Everybody wasn't okay. And that seemed to lessen some of the stigma. So what you were saying there, Kate, really resonated with me in terms of what we've been finding over recent months. How are we doing on those questions, everybody? Have we got any coming into the chat?
I'd absolutely agree with you, Emma. I think it was a real way for things to open up for schools. And I think kind of thinking of your project as well about the way that schools identify people. My PhD research that I did looking at children's experiences of parental mental health, yes. Often they would say that teachers didn't know because actually a lot of the young people and the children I spoke to, they weren't the kids that were going to be going into school and causing problems or being noticed. They were very good at keeping under the radar, having their work done because they didn't want people to question about their families or how they were coping. So actually they're not necessarily the kids that are going to be waving the red flag.
I think that absolutely, I can hear both sides of my head. My practice head and my academic head are cheering in synchrony there. It also prompts me just to be really cheeky and ask a question because I haven't had any in yet. How important is it that we are still using and promoting the term young carers? And the reason I'm asking this is because they were all, in my research, they were all talking about young carers without ever saying the word. They were showing their concern, particularly the schools, but without actually saying young carers. And I wonder how important that identity still is, whether it's still a barrier in some ways, if people just feel it's so normal within their family. Does it mean that that's part of the reason why they just don't quite get it and connect with it? Or is it really never been more important that we talk about young carers? Have any of our panel got a view on that? And I'll look up some more questions as well. I wondered about your research, Kath, with your young adult carers, whether they felt it was important to be called young carers.
Yeah, I think to be able to access the support, they had to identify as a young adult carer. So I think, yeah, in my research, it was really important for them to identify, because if they didn't, they couldn't access that support.
Yes. Okay, thank you. We've also got a question from John here. John, you're saying there seems to be good opportunities for more researchers to get alongside local young carers forums so that conversations are led by young carers, and how can we help facilitate that? Have you got ideas yourself, John, or do you want to ask the panel?
Well, I've got half of an idea and I'd be interested in what the panel thought. I put in the chat about the recent document that some of you will see, and indeed some of the organisations are here today, that was developed by the National Young Carers Voices, which is an agenda for what young carers want to achieve change. And I think we have to think about research, policy and practice, because rights for young carers and policies to make sure to support good practice need to all fit together, really. And they're pitching at both practice and legislation and policy and what they're asking for. I mean, the last presentation was brilliant, and it was where a researcher had got alongside a group of young carers and was helping them articulate their own feelings and their own wishes, and I think there's scope for more of that, but I wonder how people can help make that happen.
Can any of our panel respond to that? I think several people have been doing co-produced research and voicing, using research to help young carers voice their own needs. Have any of our panel got a comment in response to John?
Yeah, if I may, Emma, I think for me, we saw with that project just the difference it made. And so for those young carers to feel like their voices were being heard, not just being heard, but seeing change happening. So one of the questions I'm wanting to put to this group today is saying, actually, is there appetite to have a sort of a mechanism and channel for some of these opportunities to come up? Because I said, every week I get requests for different research projects coming in or different consultations. And there's only so many times I can go to our group of young carers. But actually to say, is there opportunity to join up to say, these are some of the things that we think are really important, but not just from a research perspective, but also these are what young carers are saying to us is important. These are their issues. Okay, those involved in research, is there any scope for you to do research in this area? Is this something you can put in a bid for a research project on? And similarly then, we've heard some great presentations today, but how do we get that information out to those carers organisations who are trying to make the case as to why is it so important? So I think they're two of the things I'm really keen to see if there's appetite amongst this audience to take forward.
I think that would be really brilliant, Andy. And the co-produced research I've done with children, one's out there and one's in sort of in press at the moment. That when we brought the children in to analyse data, it was completely different from how us adults would have interpreted it. And it's such a powerful way to really get access what matters most to children. So I think it would be really interesting to see what people think after the break. We've got another really interesting question from Kim here. She's asking whether we should think about maybe a national register of young carers. Kim, do you want to say anything more about that? Have we got Kim Walker? Okay, she might have problems with sound, so I'll tell you what she's saying.
Hi.
She's saying,
Hi, Emma.
Hi, Kim. Well done.
Hi, Emma. Hi. Yes, I work for the Children's Society with young carers in the Include team in Hampshire. And I was working on the Barnardo's See, Hear, Respond throughout the COVID-19 problems. And I had a number of cases working with the children in schools and the families. So it's wonderful that actually the work that you're doing now is encompassing the whole family, because that's absolutely essential. I came from sort of NHS background working in maternity. And of course, it makes me think about, is it possible for us, and has anybody ever spoken about looking at a national register? Because that actually, okay, there are lots of issues with that in terms of confidentiality and where stigma is concerned, and trying to encourage the families to actually register on that some way. But it does actually give you the evidence for getting more money in, and for signposting and just keeping on top of not losing any of those links and making sure that everybody is doing their bit to support and that the families are getting the best level of support. So that's really where I'm coming from, but I'd love to hear what the panel actually think about that.
What do you think, panel?
Can I answer, Remo? So quite a few of the schools that we spoke to were absolutely desperate to have some kind of formal recognition for young carers, some kind of way of identifying who they were. A big part of the problem that they were having with identification was that they had no way of knowing who young carers were unless the parents disclosed it or the young carers disclosed it. And they were desperate really to have some other way, a more national recognition of young carers, some data sharing with health professionals who might realise that there was a sibling, for instance, who was being looked after in a special school, some kind of just sharing of information, sharing of knowledge. So yeah, I think there's definitely an appetite there from staff. I don't know if it's there from families.
And that's always a sticking point, isn't it? And I think maybe partly what I was seeing in our stuff, Amy, was that they just start not using that language at home. And so getting parents to identify their child as a young carer has always been as complex an issue as getting schools to know if they have young carers and how those two things come together. But it sounds like almost that could be a research project to go out there and actually get into the nitty-gritty of that a little bit more. What would that look like? What are the barriers? What would be the purpose of doing it? Might be something that we might want to follow through. It seems to be a really interesting question raised there.
And just to come in just before we go to the break, I think it's really highlighted a couple of areas. I think it's a real challenge to try and get any form of list. Time and time again, I get asked by people often in local authorities who are not open to the young carers agenda, saying, have you got a list? Can you give me the list of young carers? Saying, if I give you a list, that'd be half the battle. I think there are lots of pieces of work that could be done to help in terms of locally to start building from that perspective. So Daniel's put in the chat, for example, in terms of actually, are schools required to say how many young carers they've identified? So is there any work to be done around the census return that schools do in terms of the carers registers that GPs have got, which have really built momentum with the vaccine rollout? How do we make the most of them from a young adult carer perspective, but also young carers? And then I think the final one is around in terms of data sharing and with schools. So in Norfolk, through the pandemic, they did a reverse data sharing between the schools and the local authority. So they could actually share details of those young carers who've had a young carers assessment to make sure that schools knew about them. And it was easy then for schools to also link in from that perspective. There is so much work to be done around schools having the systems to flag who their young carers are, so you can start to track attendance, attainment, progression. All of these things require systems, which aren't ever the most glamorous of topics to present about, but they're the ones that will really help from that sense as well. There's so much to do in this area.
There is a huge amount to do, and all the responses in the chat are saying what an important question it is that Kim has raised there. One very quick final one, if we've got time, Andy, because it was to Amy and Sarah, asking whether there were different outcomes, if you could tell the different outcomes from children whose schools supported them specifically as young carers, rather than immersing them in a kind of integrated group of vulnerable children and young people. Were you able to determine whether there was any difference in that? Does the young carer identification make any difference?
We didn't actually look at that as part of the research. We were just talking to staff about sort of the issues they had identifying young carers and what the next steps were, rather than how that might help the young carer as they go through the school per se. But certainly schools themselves were pretty clear. Those that were unable to use young carer specific provision felt that that was a shortcoming, and that actually the young carers would have benefited from having specific young carer support. And the schools that did offer the specific young carer support were very, very protective of that and said, no, we need to keep those as young carers, only young carers, at least for one session a week, so they can be with other young carers, just young carers. So I think the schools were pretty clear in their opinions, but I don't know how that would actually translate to academic outcomes or any other kind of outcome.
So we've definitely got a couple of themes emerging just from this, and we're going to wrap up now and have a quick break. But around identification and around whole family working, there seem to be two things that are coming up quite strongly from the chat, and maybe we can carry those through into our discussion groups after we've had a quick break. Does that sound all right, Andy? Shall we pause it there for just a minute?
Yes, if you go to the next slide, please, Belinda, for me. Just, and the next one, sorry. And one more. So we're going to go to a comfort break, but just whilst you're getting your drink and stretching your legs in the breakout rooms, which will be done automatically, it'd be really good to have a look at these questions in terms of, what are the other key issues coming out, whether that be in practice or research? Are there any sort of gaps in relation to research? So issues coming up on the ground with young carers, we've talked about a lot of them already. And then with this ideas that we've had today, how can we increase this collaboration moving forward? How can we make it easier? How can we reduce the burden on young carers organisations, on researchers, but most importantly, young carers who've got so little time as it is? So please have a think about the questions, make a note of them, because you may not have them in the breakout rooms, and we'll see people, if we can have people back for 2:40 into your breakout rooms. Thank you. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Andy. How are you? Nice to see you.
And you, and you.
I presume others are back, but
yeah, we'll give it a minute or two when we start seeing faces starting to reappear. It's always that sort of that game, who's going to go first, and I'm back.
well, it's going smoothly so far. It's going very smoothly. So all is good.
You doing well?
Yeah, good. And the sun is shining, so it's very nice.
Yes, it's turned from this morning, so it's not too bad. So, yeah. So
Yep.
if anyone's back, if you can just turn your cameras on or pop a message in the chat if your camera can't come on and you drive, stay off camera, just so I get a sense of if people are back or not.
Hi, I'm back. Penny from my time. I'm just having some difficulties with my camera at the moment.
No worries. Thanks, Penny. Hi, Fiona.
Hi there, Andy.
Hello.
Hi, Richard. There you go. People are starting to pop. Ah, Fiona. No, I've always got two Fiona Rogers, or I've got you on here twice, Fiona.
Yeah, it's because I joined on my phone and then I joined on my laptop and I didn't want to leave and come, so it's just quietly running in the corner.
Not a problem whatsoever. Give it another minute or so, and then we'll make a start. I'm just going to pop in the chat the three questions we're going to be looking at in this next sort of 25 minutes or so. Brilliant. Thanks, Danny. So in terms of we've got a small enough group and enough time, so it'd be really helpful just to do a really quick introduction, say who everyone is, just so we can get a sense of who we've got in the room, if that'd be okay. So I'm going to go as people appear on my screen. I'm going to start with where I can see people from that sense, because I know that they're back. So I'll start with Daniel.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Hi, yeah, my name is Daniel Phelps. I run the Twitter account at Young Carers Info. I'm a researcher at the University of Winchester. I'm visiting fellow there, and I've worked in practice for many years before I started doing formal young carers research.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel. Go to Fiona next.
Hi, I'm Fiona Rogers. I'm a school nurse by profession and I'm working for West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership as a Young Carers Coordinator.
Brilliant. Thanks, Fiona. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the part of the world where the Young Carers app that was recently launched was involved. Is that correct? Oh, you're muted. I missed the answer to that as to whether I was correct or whether I got that completely wrong. Go to Richard next.
Hi, yeah, Richard McManus here. I'm Intelligence and Insight Manager at Carers Trust.
Thanks, Richard. And go to Abby.
Hi, I'm Abby Squires. I'm the Young Carer Coordinator at Young Carers and Adult Carers across Dorset.
Brilliant. Thanks, Abby. You froze at least my end as to what organisation you're from, but we got who you are and your sort of role around the area you're covering. So great to have you here.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
It was Carer Support Dorset. Sorry, my internet must be good.
Brilliant. Thanks, Abby. Go to Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm the Young Carers Project Manager at West Cumbria Carers, and we support carers aged 5 and upwards.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michelle. Then go to, hope I get pronounced right, Sherry.
Hi, my name is Sherry Rishi and I'm a Carer Support Officer for Carlisle Carers and Encompass. And before doing this role, I was a graduate for psychology.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I'll go to Charlotte.
Hello, my name's Charlotte. I'm a support worker at Be Free Young Carers, which is an independent charity that supports young carers in Oxfordshire.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. And then I've got what's labelled as Crossroads Together Carer Links.
Sorry, that's me. Apologise for the camera. I seem to have turned my laptop on this morning. It's just gone very strange. So I apologise. It's something from an 80s film. Yeah, my name's Graham Edwards. I'm from the Young Carers service at Crossroads Together, not Carer Links. Apologies for that. And I manage a number of services in the Northwest, so Shropshire, Cheshire, West, Cheshire East, and Bolton as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Graham. We go to Danny.
Hi, I'm Danny Leslie. I can't get my camera on. I'm Chief Officer at Eden Carers, and we deliver on the all-age carers contract in Cumbria, supporting carers from 5 up.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danny. And Penny?
Yeah, hi, I'm also having camera trouble, I'm afraid, but my name's Penny. I'm from My Time Young Carers, so we're a charity based in Dorset. I work as a fundraising director there.
Brilliant, thanks. And last but not least, Paula. I'm not sure if Paula can hear us. For those of you, it looks like it might not be working, but Paula's from NHS England, so from their commitment to carers programme. So involved a lot in their sort of their Health Champions programme and doing a lot of work to try and raise awareness of young carers and young adult carers and all age carers within NHS. So I've put the questions in the chat really, and we've got just about 20 minutes or so to look at in terms of, so what are the other key issues we think really being identified for young carers and their families at the moment, whether it be from practice, so what you're seeing on the ground, or from a sort of a research basis. Are there any sort of clear areas where we think actually there's probably some gaps in relation to research, or whether we think actually there needs to be more research done in that area? And then particularly from the conversations we've had so far today, how can we improve and increase that collaboration between the sort of organisations who are working with young carers and researchers and those sort of organisations, potentially national ones who want to link in and are really interested into young carers? So I've talked a lot today, so I'm really just going to open the floor to if anyone wants to come in on any of those or any thoughts you've got. Always that game of who's going to go for. Daniel's unmuted.
Hey, I'll throw something in there.
Go for it.
Just on the break, I was thinking about some of the barriers and stuff, and I think one of the things I've noticed is a lack of funding towards young adult carers in particular, or there's an adult services that starts at 18, but the service doesn't actually cater for the 18 to 25s. It's very much in a box for the over 50s, it appears, from the ones that I've seen. So, and then when you get a young carer service, they're funded up to 18, so they can't bridge that gap. So it tends to fall on the adult services, and they don't appear to be picking it up in the way that we would like to see them. So I feel like that's a bit of a barrier. I think it might change once we start going to all age carers strategies, which appears to be happening slowly. But I think until then, we're going to have this issue where young carer services and adult carer services don't necessarily work together, and the adult services don't don't cater for that particular age group. So that's just something I've picked on.
No, definitely. I think it's really key in terms of both what's happening in practice, but also what's being commissioned. So in terms of actually, I know in our local area, the outcomes that they're wanting for young carers are very, very different to the outcomes that are expected for the adult carers service. So of course, the activity that goes alongside it is very different. And I think if you've had a young carer who's had so much intensive support through the young carers programme, and then they have a really different experience of adult carers, or they're expecting that sort of regular ongoing support from that perspective, it risks them dropping off that sort of cliff. So definitely a key area there. Anyone else got any thoughts, want to come in over on that or a similar point?
Hey, I've got a thought about the second question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of potential gap, really, and maybe an opportunity also. I think there's been very little research done on young carers supporting people regarding substance misuse and alcohol specifically. I think there's been quite a lot of evidence to suggest that substance misuse and alcohol problem drinking has increased significantly over the last 18 months or so, but there hasn't been corresponding research on young carers supporting these kind of people. So yeah, I wonder if that's maybe a bit of a gap.
Definitely. I think it ties back in then to almost what Graham was saying about then what support is it they need. Because I think, again, often it's a real challenge to understand, well, what support do they need do they even associate as the title young carers? So I know in Norfolk, there's a young carers service, but then there's also an affected others service, which is about those who are supporting someone with substance misuse. I think the two definitely go hand in hand there. Has anyone else had any experience locally around that, around substance misuse, or how you support that cohort of young people?
Yeah, we have. We've come across. It's obviously a taboo subject, isn't it? And it's a stigmatized subject where, I mean, I think about young people that I've dealt with who are living around addiction, and they find it really hard to identify themselves as a young carer. It doesn't make sense to them that, you know, why am I young carers? Like, even the fact that I know that their father might be an addict, they might not necessarily know. So then they might not necessarily understand why they're with us, because they shouldn't really know what's going on. And it's maybe social care that's sharing that information with us, and then we offer them a service, and they're a bit like, well, why am I don't really get it. I don't understand. And then the other aspect that we've noticed is social care might want a very specific response from us in terms of supporting that young person living around addiction, and we're not experts in addiction. So we go to our local addiction service, and they say, well, we can only work with young people who are struggling with addiction rather than young people who are living around addiction, and trying to steer them away from that possible course of action. So it feels like it's quite a complicated, addiction particularly is quite a complicated area to navigate when you talk about young carers in terms of conversation with the young person themselves, giving them the right kind of support, and then getting the services who are experts involved with the young carers in a meaningful kind of way. So I feel like it's a big issue that, yeah, definitely.
Definitely. I think it ties in also to a linked point around things like consent to access services. So I know everyone knows Debbie Hustings from Surrey. She's really active on Twitter in the carers world. So do follow her if you're on Twitter. She got in touch because, again, it's an issue of what age young people can consent to receiving support or can actually take part without parental consent. And I think substance misuse is that one that comes up time and time again, where if you speak to the parent around addiction, no, I haven't got any issue with my alcohol use. You speak to the young person, it's a completely different ballgame. But if it's a service where they have to have parental consent, that automatically puts a barrier to them accessing support. No, I can't speak to mum. No, I don't want you to speak to mum. No, I'm not taking this leaflet home or speaking to them around that. So I think, again, that really highlights what happens in different areas around things like consent and the different ages for that. Has anyone else got any sort of thoughts? Was that hand, Daniel, you want to come in there?
I'll just chip in briefly,
yeah,
if you don't mind, Andy. So I just think it's a really good point, actually, Richard. It's one of many, I would say, but it's a particular area that we know has increased recently during COVID, particularly. It's not just about consent, I don't think. It's also about engagement as well. Speaking with practice hat on, engaging those young carers from those kind of backgrounds was massively resource intensive. Very difficult for services to work with sometimes, depending on the situations. There was something else I was going to say, but it's completely gone, so I'll stop there.
No worries. Fiona, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think it's just to kind of follow on from Daniel and Richard is that I lead the Young Carers Steering Group across West Yorkshire and Harrogate, and just recently we just had we had a contact from one of the staff nurses in the home-based intensive treatment team, just saying, look, can we make contact? Is there a steering group? Is there any training? Because we're seeing more and more referrals to our team, and we're seeing more and more young carers. So I suppose it's just to, add to sort of Richard saying about, support and research into that area.
Brilliant. Thanks, Fiona. Has anyone else got any thoughts around what you've been seeing in your services as sort of key areas? I know there's been lots around sort of the impact on the mental health of young carers. Obviously, you heard earlier in the presentations about education. Are there any other sort of areas where you're seeing some real sort of big issues coming up?
The main issue that we're seeing with our young carers is the anxiety, particularly social anxiety, coming back out of lockdown. Because one of our main sort of services is running trips and activities for young carers. And we've had a lot of feedback from the parents saying how important this has been in terms of actually socialising for their young carer to actually get out, be in a safe environment, be with like-minded people, because they've been having a lot of issues going back to school and with the whole social anxiety around that after lockdown.
Definitely. I think that's something that we've seen in terms of where actually business as normal has sort of resumed for everyone else, so to speak, but then actually for young carers where actually if they've got a sibling, for example, who's got particular health concerns, or if their parents have been unwell, or they're seeing a rise in cases. It's just that fear that in terms of, yes, they've had their vaccinations, yes, my parents have had their vaccinations, but actually we still see lots of people where they have had their double vaccination and still sort of testing positive. So it's that fear. And I think particularly with the sort of the easing of the restrictions and a real mixed bag as to actually, are people wearing face coverings, or what's the response to it from that perspective? Really just adds that extra barrier for people going out, because it's not just about them, it's about actually what about if the person I care for sort of gets unwell from that sense. Has anyone else seen that with their sort of young carers, Michelle?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. And also we've done some trips over summer, and we've had quite a bit of feedback from the young carers themselves that have said, oh, there's too many people and I'm not keen of that. We've tried to keep our numbers low, but even with low numbers, they really weren't keen. And the other thing that we've had that's been really, really concerning was young carers really anxious about going to school, but schools not having anything to back up themselves and how to support those children and those parents. So we've had parents phoning us saying, what do I say to school? My daughter really doesn't want to go. And they're using words like they are terrified. They are absolutely petrified of catching COVID, passing it on to somebody in the home because that person may die. And you can understand how scared they are. But then the schools are saying to us, but we've had no support and we've got no guidance on how to deal with this. So the only guidance we've had from government is that children need to be back in school. So then they're saying that back to the parents, and you're just stuck. It's like, where do you go with that? It's, you've got children who are in school who are terrified. Now, how are they learning? Or you've got children who aren't going to school, but aren't being maybe completely honest about why they're not going to school, because the schools are saying we have to be in school or it's marked down as unauthorised absence. So we've really struggled with that since COVID.
And I think it then leads on to a point which we've seen sort of anecdotally, is in terms of actually sort of a rise in sort of young carers being taken out of school to homeschool, and the experiences of young carers who are homeschooled. As people may know, actually, it's a really hard area to know actually what is the impact on them, or in terms of what is the effect from that perspective. I've definitely seen it in lots of arenas where people said, I don't feel safe for them to go back to school. I'm going to homeschool them, or I don't like the response that the school have put in or lack thereof. I'm going to homeschool them. But I think in terms of understanding what's the impact on them in terms of their attainment, in terms of what's the impact in terms of them for actually sort of continued sort of progression into further education, HE. I know from a research perspective, it's how do you reach those young people in terms from that sense, but I don't know if anyone else has seen that sort of issue or it's an area of interest. But I think just going to sort of flick topic completely as we sort of head into sort of last 5 minutes. In terms of, a few of you mentioned that you work from sort of the age of 5 up, and I think in terms of one of the areas where we're looking at research is in terms of a lot of the research tends to focus on sort of secondary age pupils. So if you look around the statistics around young carers being bullied, it's focused on secondary school. If you look on the number of days missed, it's often focused on secondary schools. And I think in terms of understanding the experiences of these younger children, I was just wondering in terms of actually what sort of support is that youngest group looking for? Actually, are you seeing lots of referrals for those sort of 5 to 7? Do your staff know how best to support them? Because I know for us, we're seeing that as a real trend, but actually, is the support that's offered the right support? Is it making a difference for this group? It's really hard to tell. But does anyone, which organisations are working? So a few of you are working with 5 upwards. Does anyone want to come?
We are at my time. We do quite a lot of work with, we do a lot of work with schools generally, but we do really everything that we do in secondary schools, in primary schools as well, obviously sort of tailored slightly. But the feedback that we get from the primary schools that we work with is that, our support does have a huge impact. And so I think it definitely is still relevant, maybe even kind of more so, because I think, the earlier that we can deal with certainly the emotional kind of issues, the better, before they're allowed to kind of spiral into bigger issues in old age. So that's how we deal with our younger age group is through the primary schools.
Brilliant. And I think, Penny, you've identified a sort of a key, is that balance. I think it's in terms of getting that support in place, that sort of early prevention sort of agenda, with actually not making it the default, say, oh, well, actually they care for mum, so our response is we refer them to the Young Carers organisation, rather than saying, actually, okay, she's caring for mum, why is that 5-year-old caring for mum? Actually, what support is best for that family in terms of actually making a difference? And it may well be time with other young carers, brilliant, perfect. It may well be some one-to-one support to understand the impact of mum's condition, and do they understand what are their worries about it? But actually, if the solution is mum needs to get the support to actually reduce the impact, it's about what's the best sort of intervention there. I'm going to see Daniel's put in there in the chat sort of really useful resource, which if you haven't seen it, sort of highlights some of those issues and experiences that the Carers Trust put together. Has anyone else got any experiences around this age group or what you're finding, Charlotte?
We register from 8 and upwards, but we do get referrals for under 8s. So it's actually really interesting to see how many different organisations do work from 5 and upwards, because I didn't think many people did, but there is obviously a need there. So it's actually really interesting to see that. What we find most of our sort of 8 to 10-year-olds are struggling with, especially recently, is understanding their cared for's diagnosis, and especially when it's a sibling, as they get older and they start to understand more, actually realizing that they are a young carer and that things are different for them. And we've found that that's become more obvious with COVID, because they've spent so much more time together that now going back to school, they're starting to realize that their situation is actually very different from other people's. But we find, in terms of support, we find our youngers much easier to engage with than our teenage young carers. Our teenage young carers are a bit like, oh, too cool for you. Whereas the youngers are like, yeah, and we'll just lap everything up.
And we've seen out of our virtual support that the younger ones continue to engage in the virtual ones, whereas the secondary age, no, it's done its day. I spent half the last year, more than that, on Zoom, on Teams, for whatever it might be. So it's definitely one we've seen from that sense. So Charlotte, just out of interest, when you do get referrals for sort of that younger age group, that 5 to 7, what happens with those sort of children and young people at the moment?
We signpost them on to other support. Oxford isn't great for young carers at all, so there's not really anything there for them, to be perfectly honest. I normally end up signposting to Honeypot, who are a residential young carers group down in the New Forest, even though we're in Oxfordshire, because that's really the only thing that I've got currently. There's not much there at all, but we just try and signpost on or get support in other ways, like school clubs, which isn't young carer specific at all, but that's we don't really have anything else.
Yeah, Daniel, you look like you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Just a couple of things. So the last question about the collaboration between researchers and carers organisations. I mean, that's really pertinent to me as a researcher, because normally we're having to go to carer services. I think it's different for every researcher because they will work in different ways. But as an independent researcher myself, I'll be very happy for services to come to me and say, would you be interested in this? Absolutely. Just wanted to just flag up, just something came to mind. It's kind of a warning bell about the discourse about young carers, the term young carers, the idea of the register as well. For many years, we've talked about the dangers perhaps of the label. Now, I'm more than anybody very supportive of young carers services, supporting young carers, and I think they're absolutely essential. At the same time, I think we've got to be careful about forgetting that young carers are young people first and foremost. They're also carers as well. And I think, one of the big things that we did talk about years ago was trying to move the young carers back into mainstream and keeping them in mainstream, not necessarily having that heavy label on them. And I just think there's a real balance there that we don't want to forget. And it just seems to be that it's kind of tipping perhaps one way. Some young carers will be young carers for life. Others won't be. They may be a young carer just for a few weeks or a couple of months. So I just think we've got to bear that in mind.
Definitely. And I think that is a really good way to finish in terms of that balance is key. I think sometimes a response can default to, oh, they've got caring responsibilities, oh, we'll get them through to a young carer service, where actually it might be, no, they wouldn't be a young carer if you got the support for mum's mental health in place, for dad's alcohol addiction, for the siblings' disability. And I think that balance is really key, sort of moving forward. So brilliant.
Precisely, yeah.
Thanks, everyone. And I shall see people in the main rooms.
Thank you. Thanks.
Brilliant. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you all for those for coming back from the breakout rooms. I think if it's anything like our group, there's some really useful discussions in there about some of the issues coming up, but also some of the opportunities moving forward. So if I could just ask, in terms of, to start with, one of the facilitators from each group just to sort of come in with what some of the key points that were identified were from your breakout room, that would be much appreciated. So if I start with, can I start with Melanie and Eloise? I think you're in breakout room 5. We'll start with that one.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So in terms of issues, things like lack of understanding and denial. Someone mentioned about having a schools link worker in post to really focus on the schools that aren't recognising, almost shaming them. Also trying to identify earlier, so not waiting until crisis, but trying to identify young carers earlier. Linked to the denial is people feeling because they're in an affluent area, they don't have young carers, so that lack of understanding there. And one approach which was quite helpful was, rather than focusing on young carers, was talking about actually asking schools or other professionals, how are you supporting young people whose parents or siblings have certain conditions, so focusing on that instead, which links to one of the research areas was perhaps looking at the benefit or otherwise of using alternative terms to young carer. I think also recognition that it's not just schools, so recognising, you know, it's beyond, it's not just educational professionals. One thing about research was also, there was a focus on longitudinal research. So looking at the longer term impacts, you know, really following people through, right through to, because, you know, we often come across people in events like this who say, oh yes, well, I was a young carer a couple of decades ago or whatever. And it's like following that through to see what longer term impacts that has had. And also with the pandemic, following through the longer term impacts of the pandemic on particularly education. Another area for research was around, there's lots of mention of the postcode lottery in the presentations today. So if there could be a geographical element and potentially mapping services, you know, where there are good services and where they cluster, and then mapping that against young people's outcomes across the country or across the UK, just to see any kind of connection there. I think overall, definite interest in collaboration for the reasons of resources are tight, what's the point reinventing the wheel, that kind of thing. Saul Becker highlighted about the 6 European country project developed with Carers Trust, which should be really helpful in terms of signposting people to local services. Recognition that there's no national association of young carer workers. Definite interest in continuing the networking from today and being able to share resources, having a much stronger lobbying power, that kind of thing. So I hope I haven't missed anything. Eloise, please shout if I've, or anyone in the group, if I've missed anything fundamental. And I did sort of touch very quickly on the, do we want to do similar for adult carers? And it was quite sensibly pointed out that one of the reasons there's such a focus on young carers is because they're so often neglected and all the focus is on adult carers. So let's just be careful. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mel. Really appreciated some, and I think a lot of the points you put there sort of really resonated with what we were discussing around our balance between the sort of the label young carers versus making sure they are getting identified and properly supported. Brilliant. If I could go to Kath and Emma next for sort of the key points from your group, please.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, we had a great chat, I think. We did have a few technical issues, so there are a couple of people to follow up with after. One of the things we were talking about is this identification and how we've got a massive ethical issue here, because if we could, let's just say we could identify all the young carers in the country, what are we doing then? Because people are very keenly aware of the lack of services that are around, that it can't all fall on the shoulders of projects, and that things are so stretched that there are some ethical issues in terms of identification that, you know, that's only one little bit. So we thought about that, and also in regards to research as well. Particularly, we were talking about co-producing research with young people, which generally we felt was a really positive thing to do. We've also got to be careful about managing expectations. To that end, identifying young carers is a problem in practice, is also a problem in research, that in order to really understand the needs of this group, we've got to find them. And so that is a commonality. A really interesting way forward, a point raised by John, was that actually, you know, I think John was really saying, we're not going to get any more support from young carers unless something changes politically, and whether we should be using our research and the knowledge from practice to apply pressure politically. In particular, he flagged the all-party parliamentary group and the health and care bill. So maybe this is a possible direction and strategy for what we do together, is actually try and apply that political pressure to try and lever something by which, you know, identification would have a purpose and an end goal that is really positive. We also felt quite strongly about there being a gap both in research and practice around young adult carers, that this is, the support stops at 18, they deselect before that anyway, they're coming out, they're adolescents, we talked a lot about that. So young adult carers and their needs is an area that we'd be really keen to explore more about, and those transitions to adulthood. And that actually there is real disparity around young carers, recognition of young carers in regard to people like care leavers. Young care leavers are supported up until 25, young carers are certainly not. So all of that. Cherie also flagged community asset-based support, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't completely understand, but I am flagging it because Cherie couldn't talk on the thing. And also a thought that maybe we could look at tracking successful projects, what happened to where there were young carer-led initiatives, what happened to them, what did success look like, and where are we sharing that learning? So that seemed pretty good for 20 minutes. Have I missed anything in our group, everyone? We think we've got it. Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to say, I'll be asking the facilitators to sort of send me the sort of key sort of notes so that I can share them with the slides and the recording after the event as well. Amy and Jacqueline and Belinda and Kate, were there anything sort of different in terms of key points that came up from your sort of breakout rooms at all?
Amy, please feel free. We will chat.
Okay, hi, thanks, Jackie. Okay, so we talked about the care actually extending up to 25 in some cases, and potentially removing a barrier by not needing parental consent for those who were GILIC competent and over the age of 13. It was, I think it was Nikki who was saying then that actually they got a lot more referrals when it was down to the young person whether or not they wanted that extra support. But obviously to attend respite activities and what have you, then parents needed to buy into it as well. But perhaps that because they were already involved with the service by then, it was a little bit easier to get parents to agree. We talked again about trust and openness between schools and the young carers and their family. But we also mentioned that having one designated member of school staff was probably not adequate, particularly if that staff member was part-time or perhaps was a lower paid member of staff. Perhaps turnover for that particular role might be a bit too high. And actually we just needed all school staff members to be young carer aware and open for those conversations, but also open to looking for any particular warning signs that a young person was struggling in some way. We also talked about young carers as a label and both the pros and cons of having that label in terms of needing then some kind of criteria or definition, which is going to be really, really difficult to pin down, but also perhaps that also being a barrier to help. If you don't tick all of the boxes, for instance, but there are some other boxes you tick that aren't on the checklist, are you then considered to be a young carer or not? And we talked about, you know, carers looking after parents versus being a sibling of somebody who needs care and taking on that emotional anxiety, but not necessarily the physical housework chores and those sorts of discrepancies. So we had quite a lot of conversation around that. Again, we talked about adult young carers and that there isn't as much awareness of adult young carers and certainly not as much support in places like universities and probably in employment and things like that, as that awareness and that support. So that perhaps needed to happen and would happen more, perhaps the more people spoke about these issues. We talked about transport links being a massive physical barrier to the young carers actually accessing the support that was available. So they couldn't necessarily get to the respite activities, they couldn't necessarily get to the support groups, but also for some young carers, actually it's just really difficult to get to and from school some days, or as they get older to get to and from jobs. So transport links and funding for transport was a definite barrier for young carers that we felt that perhaps the government should be looking into in terms of funding for those particular difficulties. And then we also looked at the skills that young carers have and perhaps promoting those a little bit better in terms of saying, yeah, but these young carers are really excellent at time management skills, for instance, and they have all these other wonderful skills that they've built up through being a young carer. And perhaps we need to make the young carers themselves more aware of the skill base that they have developed, but also to help them sell that to employers and say, okay, my education may not have been brilliant, I may have been a bit patchy in attendance, but look at all the other wonderful things that I can bring to the table. And it was also mentioned that perhaps we need to talk to young carers as if they are the experts, which of course they are in terms of being on the ground practitioners, and we perhaps need to include them more for practitioner training and those sorts of things. I think that's everything, but please do jump in if I've missed anything. Thank you.
Brilliant. I completely agree, Amy, in terms of valuing the experiences of young carers, not just in terms of awareness raising, but also what support is it that they and those families need. So if we look at in terms of in Norfolk, for example, the emergency planning support for young carers came about because a lot of them were worried, what about if I get COVID? What about if my mum gets COVID? Who will look after this person? What about if this happens? What about if we have to start shielding? So many extra worries, and that then led to that emergency support happening, which is just now business as usual for young carers service there. Belinda can't come off mute, so I didn't know if anyone from the group that Belinda and Kate was in wanted to come in with any sort of key points or anything that's been missed or not been touched on so far at all before we go to closing remarks.
I can pop in quickly from Belinda, unless anyone wants to beat me to it. No? Okay. Andy, first of all, you're absolutely fabulous. Can I just give you a little kind of round of applause, which you might not get towards the end, for pulling us all here together. Whoop, whoop. I know there's a little thing on the bottom. There we go. There we go. There's my clap and my little party popper. Okay, I digress. Just in terms of anything to add, we did, just to say that there's an absolute hunger for more collaboration between those of us delivering services and the researchers. So for instance, how do we know what research is taking place? We get a lot of things coming through our inboxes, but we don't know what's necessarily valid or which are good, or how do we select? And also we want a lot more between project collaboration. And that led into discussions around data sets. So I'm holding on to a data set of my stars, which are really interesting after a 4-year program working in schools. I'd love to be able to add it to Norfolk's My Star pot and just find somewhere of dumping that data, so we have a much larger data set and sample size that we can, you know, do something with. We didn't come up with ideas about how we could achieve that, but we just wanted to reinforce that we'd very much so would like to see that happening. We talked a little bit in no particular order about maybe wanting the gaps in terms of the research or opportunities to understand more about young carers' health, the health of young carers themselves. Some of us are seeing more young carers in our services who have ASD themselves. We're seeing some children coming from traumatized communities, either because they've been emigrating from other countries, or they may have their own mental health issues that may or may not be related to caring roles, and the whole family mental health approaches. As well as just generally, we know that young carers are at risk of greater health inequalities physically and mentally. How much do we know about this cohort? And we'd like to gather more data there. There was one of our colleagues, I think it was Sarah, they're trying to develop with Devon and Surrey, some work around inappropriate care and measures to try and figure out when that tips over. So we've got things like the panic, which Lee from mentioned in our group, that does look at the positive and negative impacts of caring, but where's the threshold where a carer tips over legislatively into inappropriate caring roles, where we know that kicks in different sections of legislation to protect them. And I think other than that, colleague was talking about just being perplexed that everyone really wants to support young carers, but when it comes to actually doing anything about it, it can be a bit of a challenge. You know, people who want to hear about the issues but unsubscribe to newsletters. Where is my colleague who said that? Charlotte. It's Charlotte, you said that. I'll give you the last word. Did you want to say something from the front line there? And if I've missed anything, can you cover?
Yeah, no, you literally hit the nail on the head. So my example was that, so we're based in Oxfordshire, and we're the only ones that specialise in young carers. And basically we've got a load of primary schools, secondary schools that, you know, subscribe to our newsletter and will retweet to the high heavens about their support. But when it comes down to them on the front line, is probably only one school that's really raising the flag for young carers, and, you know, behind the scenes they're unsubscribing to newsletters. They kind of don't want to get involved in the issue. It's not their issue. And I think Belinda just hit the nail on the head and said, you know, it is a statutory thing now that they need to be involved a lot more with young carers. And I think it's, like I just said, it's applying that research and, you know, and the experiences, and like Rachel hit the nail on the head again, like it's having it all in one space and knowing how that research and experiences actually link, and the comparisons of similarities and differences with that.
Brilliant, thanks, Shard. And I think it's just been such insightful experiences here, and I think they resonate. And I think the great thing is there is so much sort of commonality coming through the groups. I know in terms of just quickly for our group, we looked again similarly around the awareness of young adult carers. We also looked both in terms of from a practice but a research perspective about the experiences of young carers, if you call them young carers, of parents or family members with substance misuse and addiction, and the challenges of sort of linking in with them. But also in terms of that title, that label of young carers, it can be really easy to think, oh, brilliant, yep, I've found a young carer, I've linked them into the young carer service, job done, tick the box, I can move on. Rather than thinking, actually, no, this is a child who's got a mum or got a dad or got a sibling with additional needs, a disability, an illness. What support does that family need to make the biggest difference from that perspective, rather than just defaulting to referring to a young carer service? We all know the fabulous work that we all try to do day in, day out. But the key question is actually, is our support the right support that should be provided for that young person? Is that going to make the biggest long-term difference for that young person and family? And I think we've talked a lot about transition. We've talked a lot about, in terms of longitudinal, how we see what happens into their adulthood. And I think only by getting that part right will we make the real difference. So I'd just like to say, for me, a huge thanks to everyone that's joined today. But I'm absolutely delighted and really grateful that Professor Saul Becker has joined us today. If somehow you don't know, he's obviously, I'd say, the world leading expert on young carers from a research perspective. He's currently based at the University of Cambridge, but as you'll see from his biography, has a whole platitude of sort of experience. So I'm really grateful that Saul's agreed to give the closing remarks today. So I'll hand over to Saul.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you. And firstly, let me thank all of the researchers, policymakers, practitioners in the network today for joining this session. And it's amazing, actually, to see so many people involved, and it's really nice to see so many people I know, so I can see many people's faces. Daniel, hello Daniel, and lots of other people, and it is a real pleasure to see you all. Andy said, would I mind saying a few words? And so what I've done is I've listened to the full presentations in real time, and I've made myself a whole stack of notes on different themes. So you said closing remarks. This will take me just under 2.5 hours. to deliver, or I can just try and do it in about 10 minutes. Are you okay for a 10-minute version? Fine. So what I'm going to do, I was just getting your permission to do 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is quickly zoom through a range of different issues that the conversations have raised for me, and try to clarify a few points that people might be doubtful about on the journey through. So it follows the themes of the seminar and tries to raise issues for research, policy and practice. First theme, the secret lives of young carers. It is quite clear that despite 30 years of research and sort of 20 years of policy and 15 years of practice, young carers still remain largely invisible. And despite everything, we are, sorry, one of my children has just walked into the room to deliver a note. So at least it wasn't the Amazon delivery man today, but it's still very clear that despite everything, we have a long way to go to raise awareness still of young carers and young adult carers. One of the themes that came out from Emma and Kate's papers was around parents with mental health problems and the increasing incidence of young carers with mental health. And the sixth European study that Daniel and others have been involved in with me and colleagues will show very clearly, when the first article on the sort of the profile of the 6 European countries young carers is published shortly, is that mental health of parents and mental health of young carers is a key issue. And we are talking about a sort of significant pandemic of the incidence of young carers' mental health across European countries, and including self-harm, notions of self-harm, but more frighteningly, or not more frighteningly, equally frighteningly, harm to others, including the person that the young carer is looking after. We will be publishing those that paper very shortly. It's under review. So this realization that mental health is now at pandemic levels for parents, but also for young carers, is really important to recognize. And of course, in many families, there's comorbidity, a combination of mental health problems and other difficulties. Another theme that came out was the notion of stigma, and stigma casting its shadow forward. The stigma of families who are reluctant to come forward for support or to be identified because perhaps their condition is a severe or enduring mental health problem, HIV and AIDS, which I've written about, drug or alcohol addiction. And again, in the European study, we're going to start to see significant numbers of families whose children are looking after them because of drug and alcohol difficulties. So this issue of stigma has to be combated at multiple levels, at society level, but also within schools, so that people can talk about these conditions without a sense of shame. And then that moves me on to schools. This has been a big theme today from Emma and lots of people. Emma said that schools are aware of the whole family approach and expected to act as hubs of family wellbeing and intervention. And yet Amy and Sarah and others indicated also the sort of the mixed bag on schools, the postcode lottery. So we have some really great examples where schools are doing really well. They've got themselves set up, but actually we've also got lots of schools where there is no realization. In 1997, when I published the second study called Young Carers in the UK, it pointed out that young carers had educational difficulties. Up to that point, young carers were a health and social care issue. In 1997, this became an educational issue as well, because of the 2,000 young carers in that survey, a significant proportion reported having educational problems, including attendance, falling asleep, etc. The chief commissioner's, the chief education officer's circular letter that went to all schools in 1997 said that every school should have a designated young carers lead worker. 97, 107, 170. That was only 24 years ago. When I'm being sarcastic now, of course, because it was 24 years ago when the chief education officer said that all schools should have a designated lead officer. And the National Young Carers Voice group, which is represented in this, is calling for all schools to have that. And this is madness that 24 years later, schools do not have a key person or key persons who would be, if you like, a link. But of course, it is everyone's business in schools, not just that person. I wanted to just move on to sort of say something about the varied level of support that schools provide. And that's really very clear that what a school provides for a young carer varies considerably. But what we don't know at all is whether what a school provides has any impact on the outcomes of young carers. So, you know, we need to know more about what schools provide and link that with outcomes by looking at educational attainment, attendance, etc., pathways through education of young carers. So that's a big research theme, and that's one that I'll certainly be looking at, and I hope that others will be as well. Do schools make a difference? Can schools make a difference for the futures of young carers, and how and when should they intervene most appropriately? Those are the big questions really for schools. There was a lot of discussion about identifying young carers in schools, and there are a number of instruments. There's the MACA, which I designed with my colleagues, which many of you use. Lynn Kettle talked about the CAT-YC, which you can get from Edge Hill, and others are using very interesting tools to assess young carers in schools. Cheshire Young Carers is using an instrument which I think is really interesting and will be evaluating in North Wales schools. The issue of young carers or young adult carers in higher education is a thorny one, and continues to be thorny because universities are only really in the last few years waking up to the issue that there are young adult carers in their midst who are studying whilst also caring. And the research that was reported that Joe Sempic and I did, talks about the fear that many young carers at university have about dropping out. And in fact, 29% do drop out. So we just need to accept that going to university is a real challenge for young carers for all the reasons that have been mentioned. You know, how do you go to university if there's no one else left to care for your relative, for your parent? Or how do you go to university if you are effectively condemning, quote marks, a younger brother or sister to have to care for your parent? So these are just catch-22 horrid choices. And universities at the moment, apart from a few, and they're represented in this forum, are not doing so well for young carers. You know, the universities that are really pushing forward are the universities that organise this forum and a few others. But universities have a real catch-up to make sure that the transitions through university into paid employment are good and sound. And in fact, what we didn't discuss today was that next transition stage. We talked about the transition from school to university. What we haven't done, and we should do at some stage, is a transition from university to paid employment, or from school and apprenticeships to paid employment, missing out university, because those transition stages are also profoundly problematic for young carers. And it seems to me that young carers projects in their transitions work have a real active role to play in supporting young carers through these key transitions, preparing them for some of those challenges in partnership with universities and in partnership with some good employers who want to have demonstration projects of how they can support and employ young carers. So that whole area of transitions, assessments, etc., is a massive area for research, policy and practice. I think at the end of the day, we have to simply say that the absence of support for young carers in schools, in universities, in paid work, in society in general, is effectively condemning young carers to increased inequalities and increased disadvantages. It exacerbates the ones that they're carrying through from their childhood into all phases of life. And we haven't got the research yet to see what those outcomes are, but we do know that around about 1/3 of young carers who are in paid employment will enter the caring professions into low paid caregiving work in nurseries, residential care homes, etc., etc., putting themselves at most risk of COVID and some other challenges, and receiving the lowest pay for those efforts. The COVID work that Kate did was fascinating, really important. And all I would say about this is that if you think that's the first time and the last time that we're going to face a pandemic, it might have been the first time for 80, 90 years or whatever, but we're going to have other examples where we confront these crisis situations. And so it would not be unsensible of us all to think through what happens when the next lockdown occurs, whether it's for a virus or something else, and how we are going to adapt our services to that next kind of crisis, because nothing will be the same. Young carers, adult carers, carers providers have increasingly, like university, moved to online provision, or blended learning, as we call it, blended services. And there will increasingly be blended services online with face-to-face. And that's something that we need to think through and also plan for the next crisis. I think it would be great to see a dedicated session of this network talking about whole family approaches. We all talk about it, and yet it's one of those slippery concepts where we're not totally sure what it means and how it works in practice. So it would be wonderful to see more about that. There's been a theme that's come through, which I think is critical, which is about the celebrating the skills and competencies of young carers. A number of people have referred to that, and that's something that I'm really interested in, because young carers are bringing to the table skills, competencies that they've acquired through caregiving, the multitasking, the sensitivity, the maturity, etc. But that comes with a cost, which we all know. But how do you sell or get credit for all those competencies and skills in university? Well, you do that partially through a personal statement, but how do you do it in paid work, etc., etc.? So working with those competencies is really important. Final few comments, really will be quick. If you think that the social care settlement that the government is proposing is going to help young carers, etc., we really shouldn't be persuaded it will. The national insurance levy will raise potentially £66 billion, of which 5.7 is for social care, 15%. 85% goes to the NHS. Of the 15% that will go to social care, they haven't yet disclosed how much will go on mental health services, which I've already spoken to you about, is a pandemic. We should not look to greater investment in our services from the social care settlement, because it's going to take years for the small amount of money to come through. All I'm doing there is trying to signal, don't wait for the cash to come in, because it's not coming that way. Very good point about the training of social workers, teachers, GPs, community mental health nurses, practitioners. It's really poor on professional training courses, and we need to increase the training on young carers issues. And finally, whose responsibility is it to support young carers? Clearly, it's everyone's business. It's schools, it's social workers, it's doctors, it's nurses, etc. It's all of our business together. And ideally, there should be no wrong door for a young carer. If they went to Andy for a service, or if they went to Kate, or if they came to me as an academic, or they went to someone else as a local authority coordinator, they should end up receiving the best service for them. And our challenge is to make sure that we don't fail those young carers, like safeguarding services have often failed very vulnerable children, because the enduring message of safeguarding is that a lot of issues could be avoided if services and conversations were more joined up. So for us to become part of the real solution, we have to ensure that we are joined up. And this final point I'll make is one of the ways to do that is for us to consider as a group of people, of which if I tried to do this 30 years ago, I'd have probably had Daniel, me and one other in the room. But now we have lots of people, we have critical mass. We should really think about setting up a national association of young carers workers and young carers voices, in which young carers are directly represented in the room, and they are nothing about us without us, but also to bring this critical mass of expertise, of policy expertise, of practice expertise together. So we share research, we share findings, we share best practice, we have an annual conference, we have seminars, and we lobby for a better deal for young carers and their families. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you ever so much, Saul. As ever, such powerful words to sort of close the event. And I think that it's really summed up exactly what this whole event was for. When we organised it, we said, do we call it a launch, or is that being presumptuous that there'll be the need for it? I think we've seen really loud and clear today just what appetite there is. I think we know what a lot of the issues are. More importantly, our young carers that we work with know what the issues are. So I think seeing the response we've had today shows there really is that appetite to share what research is happening, what's happening in practice, identify opportunities for collaboration. And so that's going to be the next step moving forward. So how does it link in with a Young Carers National Voice? How do we link in with research? So after this event, that's what I'm going to be looking to do, to say, actually, who wants to be a part of this? Who wants to bring this forward? Say, actually, we've had lots of great conversations today. There's been lots on Twitter, but it shouldn't just stop here. What we don't want to do is come back in a year's time, 2 years' time and say, well, that's really fascinating. We'll have to do something about it, and then come back in another 2 years' time. I think between us, we've got the passion for young carers, we've got the experience, but I think we've all now got the responsibility to make sure that young carers aren't forgotten, and there's so many other conflicting pressures being put on social care, on education, and on health. So I think it goes without saying, just to say a huge thank you to the universities and the academics from there who helped me put this event together. I think it's been a really productive afternoon. And of course, a huge thank you to everyone who's given up their time on a Monday to take part in this event. And I look forward to taking this forward for real action. Thanks very much, everyone. It's really appreciated.